first watched Mother a few months ago, and I had a lot of thoughts. Above all else, I thought a lot about what the movie was trying to say. And then I read online about what the obvious central metaphor of the movie was, and I realized I'm incredibly thick. Mother is a heavy and, unless you're me, incredibly obvious allegory. And I've come to think that straightforward, obvious allegories are perhaps the bane of horror. Mother's a film where a woman, just called Mother, lives with her husband, just called him. Him is, oh boy, this is all going to sound so grammatically incorrect. Him is a poet who is having trouble writing anything new. Just then, man arrives. Then his wife arrives. Then their sons, one of whom kills the other. Then more people arrive, and they accidentally break a sink and flood the house, forcing all of them to leave. Mother is upset and complains that him cannot even her. Both feel better once they've remedied that. Mother immediately knows she's pregnant, and this inspires him to write again. As soon as his work is published, excited fans come to the house and start to absolutely wreck the place. Amidst all of this, Mother gives birth to a baby in an incredibly uncomfortable scene, and then in a more uncomfortable scene, her visitors kill him and, well, eat him. Mother then blows up the house in retribution. Basically, this movie is bad shit. After watching, I ran this movie through my head a lot and thought about many potential meanings this film might have. Maybe the house was functioning as an extension of Mother's body, that the ownership random strangers felt over it was commenting on the horror of public ownership and entitlement to women's bodies. I thought maybe it was a horrific representation of the perils of being the loved one of an artist. I had a few other ideas too, but like I said, I'm really thick. This movie is a biblical ecological allegory. Director Darren Aronofsky has stated, Lawrence is Gaia, or Mother Earth, while her house represents the world, a living, breathing organism being destroyed by its inhabitants. Her husband, known as him in the film, is God. Out of boredom, he creates Adam and Eve. Their dueling sons are Cain and Abel. They also bring worshippers to praise God, who keep sitting on Mother's unsupported sink. Blah 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 flood, blah 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 Messiah, blah 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 communion and revelations. Now, I'm probably being a bit too flippant here about the film's biblical ecological allegory. After all, the environment is at the moment probably the most worthwhile subject for a horror film. After all, this subject encompasses the very real possibility of the end of the world as we know it. However, give me a chance to explain why I think this biblical allegory diminishes the film a bit. Horror is especially prone to allegory, since horror is so much about what makes us scared, both in terms of universal themes and in commenting on very specific parts of our society. It makes sense that we take from the often elevated world of horror and apply it to our own lives, to our own reality. And that process is kind of inherently allegorical. Aronofsky has stated that this film is about taking a piece of a world and confining it to a space and making it a conversation about society lined up with a personal human story. So this allegorical process, this taking from a heightened world and applying it to our own, is very much something that Aronofsky has specifically set out to do in this movie. And I think this is a good goal generally, taking the damage we do to the world, a topic that is kind of too big for us to fully comprehend, and bringing it down to a human level. However, the way the film does this reveals one of its inherent drawbacks, and one of the inherent drawbacks of Allegory. Allegory is dangerous to narrative in that it can be a way of decoding a story. In other words, the story in front of you stops seeming like a story and becomes instead just a vehicle for a message. In other words, you're not seeing people and events taking place in a reality, but rather a message being acted out. And that's not inherently a bad thing and does not destroy a work. However, it does take away some of the story's ability to seem real. Reality is, in a way, infinite. Or at least it can seem like that. Though it is constricted by laws social and natural, we are still left with the seemingly infinite possibilities of things that might be happening and things that might happen. We are confronted with people and concepts that expand beyond our ability to quantify them and to put them in boxes. A story that presents a world that feels real will function similarly. It will feel expansive in a way, even if the story is spatially confined. In other words, we experience some of that infinite in many stories. We get to experience some of the undefinable vastness that in part defines our lives when we pay close enough attention. Allegory, on the other hand, in its purest form, limits our ability to experience this sense of the infinite in fiction. And this film is pretty much Allegory in its purest form. A strong, clear allegory, one that makes it relatively obvious what just about everything in the story means, makes things in the story quantifiable. In this film, once you know the allegory, it's easy to see what each part of the story is representing. For example, here's Adam's rib. Here's Adam and Eve discovering shame, because she's wearing underwear now. Here's communion. Things become increasingly comprehensible, even in this completely weird off-the-wall film. We're able to put almost everything in neat, identifiable boxes. So while I ultimately like this movie, and admire its goal of viscerally portraying the harm we do to our world, a very real horror that stalks the periphery of our existence daily, the clarity of this film's allegory actually diminished its impact for me significantly. The fact that everything in the film was so easily quantifiable for the most part made it difficult for the movie to feel real. It made everything small. It lost that sense of the infinite that makes a story feel like it exists in a reality like our own. It becomes obvious that we're just watching a collection of themes and meanings in human-shaped clothing. So if Mother sort of didn't work for me because of all this allegory stuff, then I had to ask myself, why do so many other horror movies with clear allegories work? Like I said before, horror is often given to allegory. So many horror movies are similar to Mother in this respect. And when I began to consider this, why Mother doesn't really work for me while other horrors do, one movie consistently crept into my mind. The Babadook centers on Amelia, who sees her husband die on the day her son is born. She must raise her son alone, which doesn't always give her joy. She begins to be haunted by the Babadook, a monster that comes into her home and only gains power as she tries to deny it. It enters her, causing her first to abandon her responsibilities, and then tries to get her to hurt and murder her son, which is continuing Hollywood's quest to make me extremely scared of mothers in general. The haunting only ends when she banishes the Babadook to her basement, ultimately feeding it worms. It's still alive, but she can manage it now. And as you can probably tell from that summary, this movie can function as an allegory for grief, depression, and motherhood. It first occurred to me that what sets the Babadook apart from Mother is that it takes place in a physical world from which we might extrapolate meaning, while Mother operates in an almost entirely allegorical space, especially in the second half of the film, where even within the logic of the world that's been set up, things happen that do not really make sense except as a visceral experience of the biblical ecological allegory. So while the titular monster of the Babadook does function on a meta level as an allegory for grief and depression, it has a very real function in the story. It is a monster that feeds on mental states such as grief and depression, and is controlled only by finding some measure of peace while existing within these mental states. The monster therefore has a life within the story that cannot be just explained away as this is an allegorical representation of this. An example would be the monster is an allegorical representation of depression, and that's it. The monster is used to explore depression, but it is an entity with its own fearful, obscure logic, giving it a sense of undefinable otherness, which Mother lacks due to our ability to decode the narrative. In other words, the monster has an element of the infinite in it, in a way that nothing or very little in Mother really does. However, I next thought to myself, there are loads of plays that I like that take place in more purely allegorical spaces, settings that perhaps function more like Mothers than the Babadooks. Take Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. It is a play about two characters performing the titular action, and Godot never shows up. It becomes obvious as you watch it that every action, every bit of set design, is laden with allegorical meaning. Meaning that might be driving the action of the play in a similar way to how the allegory drives action in Mother. However, I think there are a few key things that separate Beckett's use of allegory from Mother's. For one, the meaning in Beckett's plays is more oblique. People still debate what Waiting for Godot is telling us. There is a sense of possibility in the act of interpreting what the central allegory is, to the point that it can mean any number of things at once. It is hard to feel that one particular interpretation is overriding or overpowering all other interpretations in the way that one might feel the allegory of Mother does. However, it also has characters who feel real, who exist in this space teeming with allegorical possibilities. We see people, in all their indefinable particularity, encountering the allegory, or allegories perhaps, that shape the world around them. This encounter between the individual and the allegory might serve in some way to mirror our own encounter with concepts much larger than us. Concepts like grief, ecological disaster, the divine, etc. In Mother, characters have some of that humanity taken away. They don't have names, for example. And they exist more as vehicles of the allegory than beings in their own right. Allegory, it seems, is their primary driver. On my second watch, the film felt most effective when Mother feels like a fully realized person. The best example of this is when her child dies, when she asserts herself, makes decisions, reflects on her situation instead of just kind of reacting to an allegorically determined path, which is what she and the other characters are usually doing in the narrative. So, why is it important that these characters feel like people? Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas centers much of his philosophy on encountering another person. He states that encountering another involves a recognition of the infinite in them. A recognition, as we look at their face, that they are something more than what can be contained in our conception of them. We might apply this idea in a distinctly different manner to horror films. The Babadook forces us to examine this face, undergoing pain. The film focuses so much on Amelia's face, on ensuring that we must encounter her in an intimate way. We might be forced to acknowledge the infinite in this character, because we can see the personhood of this other, that there is something else that we cannot define or fit neatly into a predetermined box, much as Levinas says. It mirrors the act of encountering another living being, and the infinite we might acknowledge if we are encountering them thoughtfully. We might acknowledge, therefore, that there is an allegorical element to Amelia, as there might be for any fictional character, that she is a tool for examining the concept of motherhood, but also that she seems an independent agent in her own right, despite being fictional. This is something that can't really happen in Mother, or at least can only happen in a very limited way. Despite Aronofsky's focus on Mother's face, the allegory makes the mother a known quantity. She too becomes a concept we can define, and her actions just about universally conform to this allegorical definition. Her function is not to be a being unto herself. She exists as a stand-in for a concept. She is not some undefinable other. Because of the way the narrative is set up, she is what she represents. This reinforces the idea that everything is identifiable in Mother. And this decoding brings a sense of the finite to this narrative. It brings a sense that I have a handle on the story, that it is not really disclosing things to me, but rather that things have been mostly uncovered and quantified. Now, it may seem kind of silly to say all this about fictional characters who, by their very nature, are circumscribed by the fact that they're invented. However, I think it gives us insight into why horror films like The Babadook work in ways that Mother does not. Perhaps allowing the audience to intimately engage with characters who feel autonomous, conscious, and fully realized is one way to ensure that your audience feels some element of the infinite, ever present in the narrative. Horror just about always lies in some element of the unknown. And therefore, this move that Mother's allegory takes us on, from the infinite to the quantifiable, might be especially damaging to horror. You see, I think Mother would have been most effective in its ecological message if it had been able to stick in the back of my mind, constantly whispering, like the best of horror movies do long after you've seen them. In this case, after I learned the central allegory of Mother, the film stopped doing that. In fact, the movie didn't really scare or unnerve me on a second watch. Michelle Pfeiffer and Baby Slaughter accepted. Horror is often at its most horrific when we bear witness to something fuzzy, something that we can't quite comprehend or define, something that bears seemingly infinite possibilities. In other words, horror often rests on an encounter with something of the infinite. Pure allegory takes us away. by taking away the sense of the infinite we might otherwise get from our encounters with these characters, or from the infinite complementary or perhaps even conflicting meanings that might exist alongside one another. If horror is an opening of Pandora's box, then allegory, if used too purely, too clearly, can be a tool to close it. And once it's closed, we're kind of pulled above the narrative. We aren't there alongside Mother anymore, searching for meaning, feeling the world she occupies, disclosing meaning to us. But we are instead suspended above her, seeing the allegory she is walking through. It's almost like we're looking down on a hedge maze, rather than walking through it. Ultimately, I can kind of lock this movie away in my mind. It almost feels like it's given me its secrets, that the allegory has removed any sense of the infinite from the narrative. Well, perhaps I'm not being completely fair. Like I said, there are other possible interpretations of this text. There are, therefore, pockets of ambiguity in this movie that may deserve some extra thinking on. But it might behoove a horror movie to leave those pockets of ambiguity, those encounters with another, those moments of obscured, infinite meaning, a little more space. And the ability of pure allegory to decode the narrative seems to be an opposing force to that sense of the infinite that preserves these pockets of ambiguity that haunt us long after the film's over. I think, maybe, that horror and other kinds of stories in general have a greater chance of keeping us coming back and giving these stories serious intellectual and emotional consideration if they maintain some element of the infinite. And perhaps, if another film takes on the issue of the many real-world ecological disasters coming our way, it might be more horrifying and truer to our own experience of the world if some sense of the infinite is kept intact. So, hello all. I realized that I didn't actually film an outro for this video the day I originally filmed it, hence the different getup. But thank you so much for watching. I just wanted to note that when I was making the video, I kind of didn't realize consciously that I was touching on some of Edmund Burke's ideas about the sublime. So if you've actually never read his essay discussing the sublime and its connection to our sense of the Gothic and horror, and even its connection to what we think is beautiful, I'd encourage you to read A Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. It has a really long title because people in the 18th and 19th centuries didn't seem to know a lot about creating concise titles, but I do highly encourage you to read it. It's really insightful and could give you a little more insight into some of the things I'm talking about with the connection between the infinite and horror. So I'm pretty sure that's all. Thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll talk to you soon.